Buonasera a tutti, benvenuti a questo nuovo appuntamento con gli Aperitech Online Edition. Io farò una piccola presentazione in italiano, ovviamente, poi lascerò la parola a Ermanno e a Manfred per il meetup di questa sera. Siamo con la community di Angular Roma e io mi chiamo Paolo e appunto, vi racconterò cosa facciamo qui in Codemotion e poi, come dicevo prima, lascerò la parola a Ermanno. Allora, gli Aperitech sono un circuito di eventi organizzato da Codemotion in collaborazione con le community, come questa come Angular Roma. E qui vedete a video, vedete i nostri canali, abbiamo il canale Telegram, il nostro dev calendar con tutti gli eventi in programma, organizzati appunto da Codemotion, e il nostro canale, e il nostro gruppo su Facebook, Codemotion Tech Community, che vi invito a iscrivervi, a seguire, così resterete aggiornati su tutto quello che facciamo e a partecipare, oltre che durante i meetup, anche dopo. Ok, qui a video vi mostro i prossimi eventi in calendario. Come vedete sono già sparsi già per tutto il mese di marzo, abbiamo già un bel po' di eventi. Per iscrivervi agli eventi o seguire gli eventi potete usare o il calendar come vi dicevo prima, o andare sul sito community.coremotion.com e registrarvi. E vi ricordo la conferenza, come già da anni Codemotion ogni anno fa più conferenze durante appunto il corso dell'anno e come sappiamo in quest'ultimo periodo siamo costretti a fare una versione online, quindi sarà appunto un online tech conference. E la conferenza si svolgerà, come dicevo prima, dal 23, il 24 e il 25. E la Codemotion diciamo coloro che seguono la community di Angular Roma, fornisce un link che dà il diritto a tutti i partecipanti di avere un biglietto premium con cui potete avere alcuni vantaggi rispetto, ovviamente se non avete voglia di prendere il biglietto premium, ma ve lo consiglio a questo punto, potete anche partecipare in maniera gratuita. E poi il link lo metterò direttamente sulla chat di Zoom, quindi chi è su Facebook, mi raccomando, passare su Zoom. Detto questo, ok, l'ultima informazione che vi do e poi lascio la parola a Ermanno. Ogni giovedì, vi ricordo il nuovo appuntamento, il nuovo format creato da Codemotion, il DevCast, dove avremo 2 o 3 speaker che ci parleranno delle ultime novità del mondo tech. E avremo anche il nostro nuovo TG di Codemotion, dove daremo delle pillole legate sempre al mondo tech. Inoltre vi ricordo un panel organizzato dalla community di Codemotion, il Challenge for Dev. Il prossimo appuntamento, questo è il secondo già appuntamento, si svolgerà il 13 di aprile. Vi invito a partecipare. Adesso lascio la parola a Ermanno e ci vediamo dopo.
Grazie Paolo per l'introduzione. Farò una piccola, brevissima introduzione in italiano e poi parlerò in inglese per Manfred, quindi sicuramente ringrazio tutti i partecipanti a questo evento e è un grande piacere, un grande onore per noi avere Manfred che è un grandissimo Angular architect di cui molto spesso leggo ottimi contenuti tramite i suoi tweet, tramite i suoi siti web di cui ci parlerà dopo, e quindi vi introduco brevemente che lui ci parlerà di tematiche riguardo ai micro front-end e come poter avere micro front-end su un monorepo attraverso tool approcci di Module Federation ed NX, e adesso lascerò la parola a lui per goderci il suo talk. So it's a pleasure to have Manfred here today. And of course, I was greeting you and I was telling all the people that I'm really happy that you decided to be here today. And so without further hesitation, I would like to give you the stage to you and have you all the time you need for your presentation. Thank you very much, Manfred.
Yeah, I thank you, Emmanuel, for the invitation. So let's get started. First of all, buonasera. This is about micro frontends and monorepos. And the big question I try to answer today is combining both actually a good idea or not? And as you can imagine, there is not a clear answer, but we will get several answers for this question that might help us in our daily business. So first of all, let me start with the most famous Italian. The most famous Italian, no, it's not Adriano Celentano, it's, you know, Leonardo da Vinci. In 1400 something, he constructed a helicopter. In 1400 something. How cool is that? And the thing is, he only constructed it because he was not capable of building it. He did not have the right material. But nowadays we have the right material. Scientists tried to build it and they found out it really works. It flies. How nice is that? Well, and the story somehow reminds me to the story of micro frontends, because micro frontends is everything but new. The idea has been around since several years. And I even have customers that are using micro frontends since times where the term micro frontend has not even been coined. But so far we needed a lot of tricks for building them. First of all, let me tell you what I mean when I'm talking about micro frontends. Well, first and foremost, for me, a micro frontend is just something that is splitted into tiny applications. So instead of writing a big flight application, we would write a booking application, we would write a check-in application, we would write a luggage application, and perhaps a boarding application. So let me check if I can minimize this, because somehow this is a bit annoying, I guess. Yeah. Okay. So we don't write big applications, but we write tiny applications that don't need to know much about each other. The lesser they know about each other, the better it is, because in this case, you can assign different teams for them, different teams working on them in a very autonomous way. Of course, when we have a lot of tiny applications, somehow we need to integrate them into a bigger wall for the user. And this means most of the time we need to load them into something like a shell. You see it here. Here I have one micro frontend. It's a tiny application built by one team, deployed by one team, and the shell is loading it. One important criteria for this is that both the shell and all the micro frontends shall be buildable and deployable in isolation. That means when I'm done, I can deploy it immediately and the shell can load it immediately. I don't want to be blocked because other teams are not done yet. Of course, in the past, building something like this, loading one application into a shell was really tricky. We needed to go with a lot of workarounds. It was somehow like with Leonardo da Vinci. The idea was there, but we didn't have the right material. But the good message is, nowadays we have the right material. Since several months we have it. It's called Module Federation and it ships with Webpack 5. Module Federation allows you to do something like this in a very straightforward manner. And this is what this talk is about. First of all, I want to show you if using Module Federation together with monorepos or with multiple repos is a better idea. And after that, we can talk about federated Angular, which is about applying Module Federation to Angular applications. Also, we talk about using federated Angular Module Federation within an Angular-based monorepo. This will show how it works and what the consequences are. But first of all, let me introduce myself. I am Manfred. I'm a trainer and consultant for Angular. I'm doing a lot of trainings for Angular for enterprise scale applications. This is my focus topic. And of course, nowadays I'm doing most of them remotely because of the current situation. If there is not a pandemic, I'm also happy to fly around in Europe and to visit all my customers. Besides this, I'm also quite connected to the Angular community. I live in Austria. I do a lot of stuff in Germany. And I'm always happy if I can work together with people around the globe, for instance, with people in Della, Italia. Okay, so let's get started with the first topic I have prepared for you. It's the big question, what shall we go with? Shall we go with a monorepo or with multiple repositories when deciding for a micro front-end architecture? Well, and obviously the answer is it depends. So let's say we have a monorepo and we split this monorepo into several domains, which are the basis of several micro frontends. In this case, we have one big advantage, namely we can easily share our stuff. Let's say we want to share some libraries, we can easily share them because they are co-located with the rest of the application. This is one advantage. Another advantage is we can get a tiny amount of isolation. I mean, this is what micro frontends and microservices are about. They are about isolating your domains, your partial application from each other. We want to prevent that booking is directly interacting with boarding, because if everything is interacting directly with each other, we cannot easily maintain it. And also this is possible here in a mono repository. We can define access restrictions. There are several tools out there like NX from Novel, which allows you to define access restrictions in terms of linting. That means you can tell the linter, well, booking is not directly allowed to access boarding. It has to go via this shared path over there to make sure that everything is loosely coupled to each other. Those are the advantages of monorepos. Sharing stuff is easy, and although we can share stuff, everything can be decoupled by using linting. On the other side, if we look at how micro frontends are described, I also call it micro frontends by the book, we see a recommendation for going with several repositories. And one reason for this is that the boundaries between repositories are quite strict boundaries. Grabbing over to another repository is everything but easy. You have to do this. Willingly. It cannot be an accident to just grab something from over there. So you have a high amount of decoupling. This is one advantage. Another advantage is you have a lot of freedom. Going with several repositories gives you probably the highest amount of freedom. You can go with Angular here and with React there. That's one possibility. Or you can say, hey, let's go with Angular 10 here and Angular 11 there. That's another possibility. So you see, you have a real high amount of freedom. But of course, freedom comes with some costs. Freedoms comes at a cost. For instance, let's say you have these shared libraries. Now, you might have to maintain those libraries for both, for Angular 11 and for Angular 10. Or if you mix and match different frameworks, you have to provide them somehow for different frameworks, for instance, in the form of web components. This is one drawback. Another drawback is you have to publish your shared libraries via NPM. That means you have to implement your libraries, you have to assign a version number, you have to NPM publish them, you have to NPM install them everywhere. And if there is a bug, you have to fix the bug, assign a new version number, NPM publish them, and NPM install them everywhere one more time. So as you see here, this is somehow annoying, especially if we talk about a bigger product that has several parts belonging somehow together. Sharing libraries via NPM is a beautiful solution if you want to provide something for other teams, for other projects. But doing this within your project can be a bit annoying. That means you need a high amount of automation here. Without automation, it will drive you crazy. Which also means you need to have the right skills. in your team, of course. Not everyone needs to have those skills. Another drawback of this is sooner or later, those micro frontends are loaded into your user's browser. And this might mean here that the user needs to load Angular 10 and Angular 11 or Angular in this version and React in that version. Obviously, this is increasing the bytes you have to download. And I have the opinion that this is not necessarily increasing your startup performance, isn't it? So as you see here, yeah, you have a lot of freedom, but this freedom comes at a cost. Of course, if you know you need this, then go with this solution. It provides you a lot of freedom. If you don't know if you need it, then I would recommend you to go with one monorepo. Go with one monorepo, use an X for defining access restrictions, and those access restrictions guarantees you that you can migrate to multiple repos a bit later. Of course, if you don't have access restrictions, migrating to multiple repos a bit later is really hard because in this case, everything will be intermingled with each other. But if you prevent this, keyword access restrictions, it is quite easy. And one more time, if you know you need multiple repos, go with it. If you don't know, start with the easiest solution, postpone your decision to the least responsible moment, and make sure you can migrate to something that's more advanced a bit later. This is an agile strategy for architecture. If you ask me, it is a smart strategy because it prevents from over-engineering. And trust me, over-engineering is as bad as under-engineering. I know it because I tried both. First of all, I did under-engineering when I was a young engineer. Then I learned about software architectures and patterns. And then I did over-engineering because I tried to apply my knowledge to everything. And my colleagues hated me because everything was loosely coupled. The code was really hard to maintain. Okay, so the choice is yours and choose wisely. Besides of using a monorepo or multiple repos, let me point out the benefits of going with micro frontends. It leads to autonomous teams. Each and every team can work in isolation. They can provide business value on a regular basis, and they can deploy on a regular basis. They don't block each other. They don't need to stick that a long time with meetings. This also means, as mentioned before, separate development and separate deployment. This also means each and every team can do their own architectural decisions. Perhaps a workflow-based application needs another architecture as a CRUD application. And they can do their own technology decisions. Saying this, while it's possible with micro frontends to mix and match different frameworks, normally you would try to avoid it. In short term, you would try to avoid it because you don't want to have a framework zoo in your browser. Someone has to download it. But in mid or long term, it can be beneficial when this is about migrating away from a given technology stack. Obviously, sooner or later, we need to migrate away from our technology stack because a typical framework lasts for, let's say, 10 years. A typical business application normally lasts for several decades. And so it's not a wonder that one business application faces different technologies over time. And having the possibility to migrate to another stack in 7 years, in 10 years, in 15 years is for sure a huge benefit. But you normally don't do this in short term. And all of these advantages are aiming in the same direction. It helps you to scale your teams. besides other minor aspects like migration in 5, 7, or 10 years. In short term, it allows you to scale your teams. And here, one big aspect is teams is plural. And as a good friend of mine told me, plural means you have to have more than once. So if you only have one front-end team, besides having the possibility for migration a bit later, this is obviously not the best solution for you. Don't go with micro frontends if you don't need them. Because while they have a lot of advantages, they also provide some disadvantages. They come at the cost. You might have version mismatches at runtime. Somehow you have to make sure that the things you are deploying individually work together when they meet each other at runtime. The thing is, micro frontends make runtime dependencies out of compile time dependencies. So don't use them if you don't need them. But if you need to scale over several teams, obviously you will benefit from it in short term. Okay, so much for the theory, so much for micro frontends, so much for monorepos versus multiple repos. So now let's have a look at one solution that is really straightforward. That was the missing link in the last years. This solution is called module federation. And if I'm using it together with Angular, I am referring to it as federated Angular. The big question module federation and hence federated Angular is answering is this here. How to load separately compiled source code. How can we do this if one team is deploying it today here and another team is deploying it tomorrow there? How can we load it into our shell in a dynamic way? Well, perhaps you are saying now, come on, Manfred, that cannot be that difficult because we have dynamic imports, don't we? So why not use a dynamic import to point over there and to grab something from over there, this or that application, and why not use it to load it into our shell? Well, the thing is, in theory, this works perfectly, in theory. In practice, this doesn't work at all because of how the modern bundlers like Webpack are working. Modern bundlers like Webpack assume that everything is known at compile time. Even the lazy parts of your application needs to be known at compile time. Everything is compiled together. Everything is optimized together. Think on tree shaking. And then, and only then, your compiled application is cut into chunks for lazy loading. But only then, and this is too late. We want to load something we didn't know upfront. And that's why the Webpack team introduced module federation. With module federation, you get two roles. One role is called the shell. The official name is the host, but I'm referring to it as the micro frontend shell. And the second role is officially called the remote. We are referring to it as a micro frontend. And now you can configure both sides. You can say, hey, let's define a mapped URL. Let's define this URL MFE1. And let's point it to this application over there, to this micro frontend. And by the way, over there, it's also called MFE1. And over there, you can say, hey, let's expose some files for the shell. For instance, let's expose this file with an Angular component or with an Angular module or with just a function. Let's expose it under this beautiful name. And then something beautiful happens. You will love it, I guarantee you. Then you can just use a dynamic import to load something from over there into the middle of your shell. That means you just use the mapped paths for pointing to your micro frontend, for pointing into the middle of it. And this is beautiful because that means that Angular itself does not even recognize that we are going with micro frontends. For Angular, this is business as usual. For Angular, this is just about lazy loading. Angular does not recognize. But hopefully, Webpack is recognizing it underneath the covers, and Webpack is doing everything that's needed to grab something from over there. And this is beautiful because that means you can use Angular as always. You don't need any other additional framework. There are some meta frameworks out there orchestrating different micro frontends in your browser. You don't need them. You don't need to increase your complexity by adding those meta frameworks to the game. Just go with Angular and let's do Webpack the heavy lifting underneath the covers. This really makes it straightforward. Well, of course, the shell needs to get some metadata about the micro frontend. And this metadata is generated by Webpack when building the micro frontend. And you have to load this metadata, it's officially called the remote entry point, into your shell. This makes sure that the shell, the host, knows about the micro frontend, how to interact with each other, and how to load it when it's needed, how to load it on demand, lazily. One of the best features of module federation is you can share libraries. You can say, hey, we have Angular on this side, we have Angular on that side, let's share it, let's just load it once. That's a smart idea because just because you have 10 you do not want to load Angular itself 10 times. That would be an overhead. You just want to load it one time and then share it across your micro frontends. This is done in a declarative way just by configuring module federation like seen here. Of course, that looks great, but now the big question is, does this work together with Angular and the CLI? And the question is, yes, it works together, but here we have a tiny challenge. The good message is the CLI is already using Webpack underneath the covers. The bad message is normally the CLI is shielding Webpack from us. And most of the times this is a good message. Because most of the times we don't want to get in touch with Webpack. I mean, we tried this 5 years ago, directly configuring Webpack with such a configuration file. It turned out to be not that funny. And that's why it's good normally that the CLI is shielding Webpack from us. But now it's a tiny drawback because now we have this module federation config and somehow we want to pass it to Webpack underneath the covers. Somehow we need to squeeze it in here. And this can be done using a custom builder. The Angular CLI is really flexible. It has this exchangeable strategy for building applications and libraries, for instance. Those strategies are called builders. The default builder shipping with Angular is delegating to Webpack. And we could now write a custom builder which is doing the same, but when delegating to Webpack, it could also delegate the module federation config to Webpack. Of course, you could write something like this by hand. I think in the core, it's about, let's say, 10 lines of code and a lot of boilerplate around it to make it work as a builder. You can do it by hand, but you don't have to because I already did it. You can download it under this name, Angular Architects Module Federation. It's an NPM package. And basically, it does 3 things for you. First of all, it generates the skeleton of a module federation config. That means you don't need to learn it by heart. You just need to fill in placeholders here. Then it installs a custom builder that is enabling module federation underneath the covers. And then it assigns a unique port for ng-serve, allowing you to serve different applications side by side. To get it, just ng-add it to your application, ng-add Angular Architects Module Federation. Then adjust the generated config, and then run your micro frontends using ng-serve. I'm always saying module federation is a bit like the 1980s. You know, you need to experience them to know what they are about. And that's why I want to show you a demonstration with all of this now. So let me jump out of here. And let's have a look at the example I brought with me. Let's try to get rid of this. Yeah. So what we see here is our micro frontend shell. And what we see here is our micro frontend. It allows us to search for flights. And the nice thing is, both of those applications are separately deployed. One proof for this is, here I'm going with port 3000, here I'm going with port 5000. This is not a prerequisite. People are asking me, is this a prerequisite? No, you can also deploy everything on the same server. But for me, this is a proof that this is also deployable in separation. You can deploy today the shell and tomorrow the first micro frontend, the day after tomorrow, the second micro frontend. And when I'm clicking here, you see it, hey, the micro frontend is loaded on demand. Also, my shell-based styling is applied to it. There are several approaches to go with sharing stylings. Sharing or not sharing is the question. Here, I'm sharing them. Of course, you're saying now, hey, Manfred, come on. Everyone can claim that they are loading a micro frontend. Prove it. Okay, I'm proving it. Let's reload this. Let's press F12. Let's go to the network tab. Let's click here. And here you see it, that my micro frontend, MFE1, is loaded on demand. It comes from port 3000. We are on port 5000. That clearly proves that we are loading something that was deployed in a separate way. And this also clearly shows that this here is more than just lazy loading. Also, here we just have several kilobytes. This also proves that we are sharing Angular itself. Okay, cool. So let's have a look into the source code of this. If we look into the source code of this, we see a monorepo, and this monorepo consists of two applications, the shell itself and the micro frontend one. They are just traditional Angular applications, and I just added the plugin I've shown you before. ng-add blah, 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 you know. I did this for the shell, I did it for the micro frontend, and when doing so, I got my Webpack configuration generated. Let's have a look into the micro frontend one. As mentioned before, a typically Angular application, and besides this, it has this Webpack config. And you don't need to worry, this is not a fully blown Webpack config, this is just a partial Webpack config. It just contains what you need for module federation. The rest is still generated for you using the Angular CLI. In here, the most important part is the module federation plugin that ships with Webpack and hence with the CLI. And here you see I have used this plugin to assign a name for my micro frontend. This is the name of my micro frontend, and this is the file name holding the metadata of my micro frontend. You know, as mentioned before, module federation is emitting this metadata file. Also, I'm exposing a module. Officially, it's called module. Behind this name, there is my flights module that is exposed for the shell. That means the shell can load this flights module on demand. If we look into the source code of the flights module, flights.module, we see it is just an ordinary child module with child roots. That means if the shell is using the router and module federation to load this module, the shell can directly jump to one of the child roots defined here. Besides this, here I'm also defining that I want to share Angular core, Angular common, and the router. I only want to load it once. I want to load it once and share it across all the micro frontends and the shell. And I won't go in details here, but those settings allow you to fine-tune what to share under which circumstances. Module federation gives you several options for this, for deciding when to share what, but this is a different story. Besides this configuration, this is a traditional Angular application. And so is my shell. Also, the shell is a traditional Angular application. Everything that's different here is it also comes with a webpack config, a partial webpack config, which just contains the stuff we need for module federation. And one more time, in here, we find the module federation plugin. Here I'm pointing to my micro frontend. That means I'm assigning or I'm defining a mapped URL. This mapped URL is pointing over there to my separately compiled micro frontend. And here I'm saying, hey, over there, the micro frontend is also called micro frontend 1, and this here is the metadata. Please load it. What you see here is what I'm calling static federation. Static federation means you have to hard code everything in your configuration. This is nice for getting started, for prototyping, perhaps even for debugging purposes. But when it comes to production, you will very likely go with an alternative, which is called dynamic federation. Dynamic federation means you don't have to configure this upfront, you configure this at runtime. Perhaps your shell is accessing a backend service, and the backend service is telling the shell, well, today we have this and that micro frontend for you. And then the shell says, okay, I understand, I've got this and that micro frontend. Let's introduce some routes to route to it or to this micro frontend. So normally this happens in production at runtime, and the key term for this is dynamic federation. But also dynamic federation is a different story. You find a lot of information for this in my blog. Today I will stick with the easier solution, and we will concentrate on going with monorepos in some seconds. Okay, this is everything that is different for my shell. Of course, my shell needs to have roots pointing to the micro frontend, and one of those roots is defined in here within my app roots file. And here you see there is a lazy root, a flights root. Using load children, it points to something that should be lazy loaded. So as mentioned before, from Angular's perspective, this is just about lazy loading. But of course, Webpack underneath the covers knows that this here is a mapped path. This is the name of the micro frontend or of the URL pointing over to the micro frontend. And this is the name of the module exposed over there. And hopefully Webpack will do the heavy lifting underneath the covers. So it's fine for Webpack, it's fine for Angular, it's not fine for TypeScript, because TypeScript does not know this name upfront. And that's why you need a typing. You need a DTS file. The name doesn't matter at all. If it ends with DTS, then the TypeScript compiler will pick it up at compile time. And here you need to tell the TypeScript compiler, hey, you don't need to worry, trust me, I'm an expert. This will work at runtime. Don't give me a compilation error just because you don't know it at compiler. And with this declaration, we are fine here. Now it's fine for Webpack, it's fine for Angular, and it's also fine for TypeScript itself. And that's pretty much everything. We just defined the configuration on both sides, and we defined a route for lazy loading something from over there. Okay, so now the big question arises, how can we use all of this with a monorepository? How does this differ from using several repositories? And the good message is, at first sight, it does not differ at all. At first sight, it is exactly the same, because module federation does not question at runtime where the source code comes from. If the source code was co-located in a monorepo, or if the source code was separated using several repositories. Module federation does not care at all at runtime. But there are some issues you have to deal with nevertheless. And for tackling those issues, I'm going with Annex. Annex is a nice addition for the CLI. It allows you to define access restrictions so that one micro frontend cannot directly access another one. They shall not be coupled to each other. And it allows you to do other stuff with micro frontends and monorepo you normally need. Let me come back to it in some minutes. But first of all, please keep in mind, I'm using Annex for my monorepo here. And in my scenario, I really want to share one library across my separately developed, separately deployed micro frontends. It's an authentication library. And this really looks nice at first sight, but there is a tiny issue. There is a tiny challenge here. The thing is, we want to go away. The thing is, we want to deploy the shell, the micro frontend 1, the micro frontend 2, the micro frontend 3 in a separate way. We want to deploy them separately. And even though we want to deploy them separately, we want them make to share the authentication library at runtime. That means at runtime, they shall talk to each other and decide which authentication library to load. Shall we load the shell's authentication library or the micro frontend's authentication library? But they shall decide on it, and they shall just load it once because we want to make sure we don't have an unnecessary overhead. And how to do this is what I want to show you in the second demonstration. In this second demonstration, I want to switch over to my library folder. When going with Annex, you get an apps and a libs folder. Here I have prepared my authentication library. And in here I have an authentication service. It's a very simple authentication service. It allows to log in the current user. This is what I'm calling authentication for honest users. You know, if everyone is an honest person, things are much easier. We don't need to check the password, just assign the username, and on logout, just put it to null. This is my authentication service. And besides this, there is also an authentication component, which is just displaying the current username. And this is what I want to share across my applications in my monorepo. Well, to share something in the monorepo, normally you jump into your Webpack config. You have seen it before. And normally you mention the NPM packages here. For defining NPM packages, Module Federation gives you this shared section. Here you could say, hey, let's share Angular, let's also share NGRX, and so on and so forth. But the thing is, now we don't have NPM packages. Now we just have a library that is part of our monorepo, a library that is just a folder in our monorepo. So how to deal with it? Well, my plugin I've shown you before gets you covered here. My plugin is also generating this 2 lines of code or these 2 statements. And here you can register the mapped path of your library. Here you can say, hey, I also want to share something I'm calling that way within my monorepo. It's not an NPM package, but nevertheless, I want to share it. So perhaps you're wondering, where does this name come from? Well, when going with monorepos, you will very likely have a mapped path in your dsconfig JSON. Some people also call it dsconfig base JSON. You have it here. And as you see here, this mapped path is just pointing to your source code, or to say the least, to your library source code. This is where the cycle closes. So within the monorepo, we are using this name to point over there to the library folder, and everything over there shall be shared at runtime, shall not be loaded. Shall not be loaded more than once. So let's opt in for this here in the webpack config of the micro frontend. Let's also opt into it within the configuration of the shell. And then we are fine. Then we can share this very library at runtime. For using the shell, let me jump into my shell's app component. I think that's not the app component. Let me jump into my shell's app component. Yeah, looks better. Or perhaps it was the shell's home component. So where is it? Home component, shell. Yeah, now we are talking. So in my shell's home component, I already get hold of the authentication service. It's injected here. And as you see here, it's imported from this mapped path that looks a bit like an NPM package, but that isn't. And here I can do what I'm calling authentication for the honest. Here I'm saying, hey, let's log in John Doe. That's the first step. And over there, within my micro frontend, within the flight search component, let's display the current username. So the thing is, if this library is really shared across my shell and all my micro frontends, then the name John Doe will show up here. This will prove that we are sharing the source code of it, that we only have one version of our service. If the source code of the library would not be shared, then we would get a different name in here, because in this case, we would get one version of the authentication library here and another version of the authentication library there. So let's try it out. And for this, we need to restart everything because we have changed our webpack configuration. And you know, changing the webpack configuration means we need to restart everything in here. Everything is started. It will take 1 or 2 seconds, or even 4 or 5 seconds. I mean, we all know the CLI. And also you might see some warnings. You don't need to be scared from them, because currently I'm using experimental stuff here. I will tell you about it a bit later. And because of this experimental stuff, sometimes I'm getting warnings. Even though we have a red font color, it's a warning, deprecation warning. You see it here. Okay, so everything is started. I am reloading my shell. I'm clicking on flights and hey, it says current user John Doe. And this really proves one more time that this tiny library is shared across my two separately compiled, separately deployed, separately loaded applications. Incredible. It's really incredible if you ask me. Okay, cool. That looks straightforward, and in theory it is. In practice, there are some challenges, because now we need to deal with version conflicts. And perhaps you're saying, oh, hey, Manfred, come on, we don't have version conflicts because we have a monorepo. Everything has the same version in there. Everything is using the newest version of our shared libraries because everything is co-located. And yes, that's true for your source code. That's true for your source code, but not for your deployed applications. And to prove you this, let me show you a tiny thought experiment. Let's say you are deploying a micro frontend 1 today. And tomorrow you are changing your shared library. And the day after tomorrow, you are deploying the micro frontend 2. And this might lead to a conflict because here you might have done a breaking change. You will only find out at runtime, and then you have users that are not happy because it does not work. So for this, there are several solutions when going with a monorepository. One solution is deploy all applications that have been changed in your release branch together. This still means you can deploy everything separately. But if it is merged into your release branch, then you have to redeploy everything that has been changed together. This way you make sure that also in your deployed servers or the deployed applications in your servers are using the same version of the shared library. And doing this is really easy with NX. Remember, I've told you before, I'm using NX for setting up my monorepo, because if going with NX, you get this command here, this affected apps command, which is just writing to the shell the names of the applications that have been changed. That means you just need to run this in your CI/CD process, and then you just need to redeploy those two applications. Saying this, you can define here what you want to compare with what. You can say, hey, let's compare the current version of the release branch with the current version of the main branch. Or let's compare the current state of the release branch with the state we had when we deployed the last time. And so everything is compared with each other, the current state with the state we had when we deployed the last time. And so NX can easily tell you which applications you need to redeploy. You still have the possibility of doing separate deployments, but everything that's changed on the release branch needs to be deployed together. Also, to make parsing this output a bit easier, I have one trick for you called this here with -- or -- plain. -- plain is just emitting a space-separated string with the names of your changed applications at the console. This can be read easily and processed by your CI/CD process. This is one way to assure that you don't have any version conflict at runtime. There is another way. Well, saying this, I'm not recommending this way, but it's possible. And if you have a good reason for going with it, then go with it. But it's very likely you won't need it. But nevertheless, let me tell you about it. The second solution I'm not recommending without having a good reason is that you start with a library version. Let's say we are starting with version 1.1. And then we are deploying micro frontend 1. And then you change the library version to 1.2. Saying this, I'm just increasing the minor version, which means in theory, this should be backwards compatible to 1.1. Then I'm deploying micro frontend 2, and that should be fine. Normally, we should go with the highest compatible version here, which is 1.2. Same major version means we don't have breaking changes. However, we also might have the case where we start with 1.1, we deploy micro frontend 1, we change it to 2.1, which might go hand in hand with a breaking change. And then if we deploy the micro frontend 2, we still have a conflict. So we cannot prevent this situation, but we can make sure that in the first case where we have a newer version that is backwards compatible, everything works seamlessly at runtime. We can guarantee that if there is a highest compatible version, module federation will pick it. But in this case, we are alone. We can tell module federation, well, let's go with the highest version nevertheless, but no guarantees. Because as mentioned, a new major version might mean we have a breaking change. Yeah, you can only prevent this with a good set of end-to-end tests. And saying this, you need a good set of end-to-end tests nevertheless, because changing to micro frontends also means that you are making runtime dependencies out of your compile time dependencies. If you want to go down this road, you just have to do two things when leveraging the plugin I've shown you before. First of all, assign a version number in your libraries package.json. This is passed. And then tell module federation that we want to share a mapped path, our auth library, and tell it we need at least version 1.1. You need caret means we need 1.1 or another version within the major range of 1. In this case, this part of the monorepo will be happy to work with 1.2 because according to semantic versioning, it should be backwards compatible. Yeah, it's possible. The drawback is now you need to version your libraries within the monorepo. And this is what normally we want to prevent when going with a monorepo. And hence, as mentioned, very likely you will go with the first solution, deploy everything together when something changed. For this, there are also some pitfalls. We are working on this. And please look up those pitfalls on our NPM page. Okay, perhaps you're saying, no, hey, this is really cool. I want to get started with it. When can I use all of this in production? And for this, one more time, I have several good messages for you and one bad message. The first good message is Webpack 5 and hence module federation is final. So go for it. However, the Angular CLI 11 is currently only supporting Webpack with an experimental opt-in. This allows you to do some prototyping, but obviously using an experimental plugin is not the best idea for going into production. So get starting with trying it out, but don't use it for production yet. When it comes to using it for production, you need to wait for CLI 12, which is due in the next month. It should be due in May 2021. And then you will get an official Webpack 5 integration, and then you can use everything I've shown you today in a production-ready way. So it takes a bit of time, but also time is solving this issue for us, time and the Angular CLI team, of course. If you like all those ideas, if you say, hey, I want to use it, then I want to encourage you to download my free ebook. It contains, meanwhile, about 5 chapters about micro frontends and about module federation, and some additional chapters for other topics that might be interesting here. Topics like access restrictions, preventing that one part of the micro frontend is accessing another part. So just download it here, angulararchitect.co/book. Okay, let me come to a conclusion. What did we see today? Well, we have seen that module federation is the missing link. It's like the material Leonardo da Vinci didn't have, the material for building a great new idea, namely micro frontends. It allows us for load separately deployed code, which is, as mentioned, the key for micro frontends. We have seen going with a monorepo is totally possible. You might also go with multiple repositories. Multiple repositories gives you the highest amount of freedom. Going with a monorepo means limiting yourself a bit, but it makes everything a bit more easy. Everything is co-located, sharing stuff is easy, and we can even share runtime dependencies, as you have seen in the second demonstration. One solution to deal with runtime dependencies to prevent yourself from version mismatches is to always deploy the changed apps. Not all the apps, just redeploy the changed apps. And if you go with NX will tell you this and this application needs to be redeployed together. Or you can assign version numbers within your monorepo, but honestly, this is somehow a contradiction in itself because we are using the monorepo to prevent the need from versioning everything. We are going with the monorepo to have what I'm calling an evergreen version policy, but technically it's possible. The shown CLI plugin allows for this. So at the end of the day, I can tell you both the monorepo and the multi-repo is possible. Both comes with consequences. Choose wisely. Okay, there is also a last thing I want you to remember. If you forget everything, please always remember this one last thing. Let me share my screen one more time for it, namely, this now is your chance to become the next Leonardo da Vinci. Where is it? Where is my Leonardo da Vinci? Here it is. It is your chance to do something like this Leonardo did in 1400 something. So take your chance and get started with micro frontends now. Thanks for having me. Here you have all my contact data. I have also uploaded my slides and my material. And if you want, follow me on Twitter so that we can stay a bit in contact. Thanks for this and have a nice day. Mille grazie.
Grazie Manfred, grazie per questo talk di oggi. So thank you for this talk, and I would like to give you a little question time. So per tutti quanti potete scrivere le domande qui nella chat. You can ask question in chat. I will start with one question, if it's okay for you, Manfred. So you talked about how we can prevent sharing mismatch by deploying the same version in the release repo. Okay, so the solution number one that you talked about. But I was thinking, and I would like to hear your opinion on the fact that maybe a user has loaded a part of the, let's say, the shell of the application, but he hasn't loaded yet one or other parts. So it hasn't loaded micro frontend. So in this case, we can have one version for the shell. Maybe it's the one that's been outdated by the next version of micro frontend 1, which inferred a new version on the shell because we needed to do a merge, right? So we are not preventing this issue, right? We need to have like a service worker or other things that will ensure that even though we deploy everything, we need to update everything on the user end, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, that's a good question, and it's really the most difficult part of going with micro frontends. One way to address this is to limit yourself, to make sure that you only have compatible versions in your system. The thing is, you can even configure module federation to give you a runtime error or a warning if there are two non-compatible versions of something. This is just a matter of configuration. And hopefully, if you have a good set of integration tests, you will find out that you have two non-compatible versions of the same library and that you have to do something against it to prevent it. This is one possibility. Another possibility is you can tell module federation to always load the highest version. Perhaps the highest version or only the highest compatible version. So let's say we have version 1.1 here and 1.2 there. If we tell it to load the highest compatible version, we would go with 1.2. There's also a possibility we can configure it. We can also say, hey, module federation, if there is not a thing like a highest compatible version, load this version here and this version there. In this case, we are duplicating everything at runtime, which might work, especially if we are talking about a stateless library like Lodash. It does not matter if we are using Lodash version X here and Lodash version Y there. But if we go with a stateful framework, mixing two major versions is somehow the way to hell, because we don't want to have in one browser window Angular 11 here and Angular 12 there, because Angular is stateful. This instance of Angular will only know 3 components. This instance might know other 3 components, and they don't know each other, besides other issues you might get when doing this. If you really, really want to do this, if you really, really want to share different versions of Angular or even different different frameworks, different single page application frameworks, you have to go with web components, because web components are wrapping the framework and web components are only exposing something that is well defined by a browser-based standard. This is possible. And if you really, really need it, you find an article for this in my blog. If you don't need it, if you can limit yourself to just one major version of everything, this is the most straightforward solution you can get. For everything else, you need some tiny workarounds and tricks.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. We have a question from Gabriel. He's asking, do you know if there will be a support for the React CLI when it will be available?
The good message is you don't need a plugin or an extension for the React CLI, because the React CLI allows you, I think you are referring to something like Create React, and shows your webpack configuration. That means you see it, and so you can extend it. With the CLI, this is not possible. The CLI never shows you the webpack configuration. This was a decision by the CLI team. They want to hide it from us. And that's why we need this plugin to squeeze into the CLI to tell the CLI, hey, CLI, please leverage module federation. The same is true for Vue. In this case, you can also tell the tools, please show me the webpack configuration. Please let me extend it by hand.
Okay. So we'll wait for other questions. And I do have another one, but it's on the way of, not doing, doing something that's in contrast with monorepo. So you said that we should not use versioning, right? And that's in the philosophy of monorepo, so that's okay. But then I was thinking regarding the mixing of different versions, right? That if we then use also the dynamic linking, maybe using, in the linking process, a build version or other things, they may deal with conflicts, because we can then load that particular version because we recognize that dependency on this version. So is something that you have ever had some thoughts on it, or is something other people are working on it? I just want to see the expert point of view on that.
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and I have a good message for you. This already works in module federation. So if you want to go this road, it works. And this was also what I used in the second example, where I did versioning, even though I was using a monorepo. In this case, at runtime, module federation reads the metadata, and so it knows, hey, you are providing version 1.1, you are providing version 1.2, so let's agree on the highest compatible version, which is 1.2. This already works out of the box. The only question is, do you want to go down this road? Because if you go down this road, you might get a situation where you have two non-compatible versions. And then one more time, you have a conflict.
Yeah, that's true. Okay. So I don't see other questions. So Paolo, do you have other things to add from Codemotion? Is there something else we need to say about?
Yeah, sorry. Can I make a question?
Hi, Marco.
Hi.
So Marco is from the Angular Rome organization. So
sorry. Okay, Manfred, thank you very much. Your talk was really interesting. I'm more interested in the dynamic solution. Can you tell me if you have any example or when this is gonna possible to apply? And yeah, so this is generally the question. Thank you very much.
So it's really an important topic. I didn't show it today because I wanted to focus on this monorepo aspect, but nevertheless, it's important. And you find everything in the ebook I've pointed you to, but also in my blog. For instance, here, there is a blog article about dynamic federation. And at the end of the day, what I'm doing here is I'm getting some metadata from the backend. The backend is telling me, you find this micro frontend here and that micro frontend there. And then I'm using some helper functions of my plugin to load this stuff dynamically. So what you see here is, here I switched out the dynamic import we normally are using for lazy loading by a call to the helper function load remote module. And here I'm pointing to my remote module using strings. The important thing here is those strings can be dynamic. That means we can switch them out. We can get those strings from the backend and then just put them into this routing configuration. Okay. And this is it more or less. There are some minor things to respect, like loading metadata upfront. Even though you are loading the micro frontend lazily, you should load the metadata upfront, because module federation needs it to find out if we go with your version 1.1 or with mine version 1.2. But for this, there is also a solution, and you can find it in this blog article. Let me copy it into the chat.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
You are very welcome.
Sort out one of the problem I had. Okay. Thank you, Manfred.
I thank you. So here is the first article, and here are the slides. And here is the ebook where you find more information about it. Okay, cool.
Perfect. Okay. So, okay. Okay, so if we don't have other questions, I will say that it's time, we end the meetup, and I would really like to thank you, Manfred. Really appreciate, always for your, the quality, and also the kind of talk you give is always very, very interesting. So thank you very much. I really appreciate that. So, okay, we will see you the next time and around on Twitter.
See you next time. Thank you, Manfred, and thank you, Hermano.
Yeah.
See you next meetup.
Yeah. Okay. Goodbye.
See you.
It was
Goodbye.
a pleasure. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Mille grazie.